Hello everyone, welcome back to the Lingua Loom. Today we're going to start another episode of the Tracing the Critics series. This is phase 2. We have entered in this phase which is dealing with Renaissance and neoclassical literary criticism information. So this is episode number 5, which is about Sir Philip Sidney, and the work is An Apology for Poetry, A Defence of Poesy. So you can either say A Defence of Poesy or An Apology for Poetry. The first major work of literary criticism in the English language. Before work were in different languages, but this one is the first ever one that's totally grand in English language. A defense of poetry against Puritan attack and a landmark synthesis of his Aristotle, Horace, and Renaissance humanism. Before starting the video, please do like, subscribe and share and take comment, as this means a lot for the channel. Thank you, so let's move. Okay, section number 1, the man and his movement. We're starting with his intro, which is Sir Philip Sidney was one of the most complete exemplar of the Renaissance ideals. A courtier, a soldier, diplomat and a poet all in one. Born in Kent and educated in Shrewsbury School and Christ Church, Oxford. He moved in the highest circle of Elizabethan culture and served Queen Elizabeth I as a diplomat across Europe. In 1583, he was knighted. In 1586, he died of a leg wound sustained at the Battle of Zutphen in the Netherlands, aged only 31. Well, that's not that much of an age. A policy was written in approximately 1579 or 80, in between them, almost certainly in response to Stephen Chaucer's A School of Abuse, which was written in 1579, a Puritan attack on poetry, drama, and theatre, with Garson, has dedicated without permission to Sidney himself. Sidney's irritation at being associated with Garson's assault on imaginative literature appeared to have been one of the motivating sparks for the essay. However, Sidney's argument reached well beyond Garson, his real interlocutor, or Plato, Aristotle, and Horace, and his ambition is nothing less to establish poetry's nobility as a form of knowledge and moral instruction. So this was said a basic introduction about that who is and what made him write this work. So, the intellectual context is English Renaissance humanism, a period defined by recovery of classical learning, a conviction that education could improve human virtue and prestige of Latin and Greek models. Sidney writes at the precise moment where England was developing as a literary culture in vernacular, with Spenser, Marlowe, and eventually Shakespeare on the horizon, and the Apology functioned partially as a manifesto for that emerging literature. So why we discuss this? Well, because to first understand any work, it is very good and easy to know the writer so you actually know what you're dealing with. So An Apology for Poetry is the first major work of literary criticism in the English language, a synthesis of Aristotle, Horace, and Renaissance humanism in defense of poetry's nobility. So the text, what kind of work is it? The Apology for Poetry, also known as Defense of Poesy, exists in two slightly different versions, published in 1595, 9 years after Sidney's death. The title Apology used the Greek word apologia, a formal argument in defense of client and position. The title defense is more straightforward. Both are accurate. Sidney is acting as advocate for poetry in a judicial oration. So, in this work, Sidney tries to defend poetry, presenting it as a great work. So, Sidney writes in a form of forensic rhetorical oration, following the classical structure of the argument in law, exordium, which is introduction, then statement of the cause, then division of the argument, then proof, and refutation of opposing arguments, then conclusion. This is not accidental. Sidney is stating a trial of poetry and argument with full oratorical skill for the verdict of acquittal. While its ideals are not wholly original, Sidney draws heavily on Aristotle's Poetics, Horace, or Poetica, and most recent writers such as Boccaccio and Julius Caesar. So it represents as a scholarly article in the text note, the first synthesis in the English language of various strands and concerns of Renaissance literary criticism. Its claim about the function of poetry, the nature of imitation, and the relationship between poetry and virtue were to shape literary criticism across Europe until the late 18th century. So, this is what the text is about, how it's written, and its importance. Suppose it therefore is the author of imitation, for so Aristotle termed in his own mimesis, that is to say, a representing counterfeiting or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this end to teach and delight. So, the golden word, Sidney's central argument. The most original and most celebrated idea in Sidney's apology is the concept of golden world. Sidney argues that poet, unlike the historian or natural philosopher, is not bound by the natural world actually is. Nature gives us a brazen world, imperfect, fallen, limited. The poet delivers a golden world, an imagined, idealized representation that suppresses nature itself in its capacity to embody virtue, beauty, and moral possibility. So this represents the beauty and the power of poetry in this paragraph. Then this argument works through the crucial concept Sidney introduces, the Fore-Conceit. Before the poet writes a word, a complete conceptual image, a Fore-Conceit, exists in the poet's mind. The poem is the externalization of this pre-existing ideal conception. This moves poetry decisively away from mere copying. The poet does not imitate what is, but create what should be. So this is here. He argues the claim that and rejects the claim which is the poetry is copy of copy. He said the poetry is not copy of copy. It is meant to create what it should by using the power of imagination. So here this defies the Plato's claim which is poetry is copy of copy or it is mere imitation. Sidney used this argument to answer Plato directly, and this is the same that we say the copy of copy. So nature never set forward the earth in so rich tapestry as driver poets have done. Neither with a pleasant river, fruitful trees, sweet smelling flowers. Her word is brazen, the poet only delivers a golden. So this is Sidney's boldest claim, and it has both philosophical depth and rhetorical brilliance. For arguing that poetry suppresses nature rather than merely imitating it, Sidney elevates the poet above the historian, and in some respect above the philosopher. The poet uniquely makes virtue visible, concrete, and moving, embodied in character and action that can stir the reader's will toward noble behavior. So here, Sidney portrays poets even more grandeur than a historian, and on top of that, a philosopher. That poet is even greater than a philosopher. This is wow factor. So 5 key concepts. Sidney's argument is built in 5 interlocking concepts. So let's check this. Okay. The speaking picture. Sidney's definition of poetry as a speaking picture, drawing in a classical formula, is the capture how poetry combines with the vividness of visual representation with the temporal unfolding of language. So this is what he said, that poetry is a speaking picture with added dimensions of narrative, argument, and moral direction that language alone can supply. It is much more than that. The image rests attention, the speech instruct, and the poet achieves both at once. Then the Fore-Conceit. Before writing, the poet possesses a complete conceptual image, the Fore-Conceit of what the poem will be. This prior conception distinguishes genuine poetic creation from mere copying of mechanical imitation. So it was said that before writing anything, poet imagined in his mind or her mind that what they're going to write. Then comes the three kinds of poetry. Sidney classified all poetry into three types: sacred poetry, which is highest and oldest; philosophical, which is second in line; then comes the riot poetry, which is imaginative, fictional verse, which he prizes most. So he said that riot poetry should be prioritized because it follows imagination. Then moving to virtue. Okay. Poetry's supreme claim over philosophy and history is its power to move the reader and virtuous action, not merely to inform the intellect, but to engage the will and the emotion. So Sidney here defines poetry that it is above all because it has the ability to move a person emotionally. Then comes the poetess maker. Sidney derives the English word poet from the Greek poetic, which is maker. The poet does not merely describe or imitate, the poet makes. This creates power such the poet apart from other writers, because the poet imagines and then writes. Then comes the four charges against poetry and Sidney's reply to them. First charge is poetry is a waste of time, a trifling occasion. Well, the answer is the charge. Well, this is the charge, and Sidney's reply is that Sidney argues that poetry is the oldest of all arts and the most honored thought throughout human history. In ancient Greece and Rome, in Persia and England, poets were revered as the first philosophers and teachers of civilization, those who first brought knowledge, moral wisdom, and cultural identity to humanity. He traces the figures of Poietes, the poet prophet, through numerous cultures to show that poetry has never been considered trivial by those who understand it. So this is what he suggests, that the poet is someone great. This is not a waste of time. It is something worth being great. Then comes the second charge, which poetry is the mother of lies. Sidney replies that lie, properly defined, is assertion of something false as it was true. The poet never makes such assertion. When a poet writes of Achilles or King Arthur, no one is bound to believe that these figures are real historical persons. The poet explicitly presents not what is, but what should be and what might be. Picture of what should be and not of story that have been. So this is what poet, when we say the poet gives you imagination, so its imagination is in mind of a poet. It is not in the outer world. Even if they take example from the outer world, they meant to glorify these examples to present them more beautifully. So it is not the mother of lies, it is mother of imagination, you can say. Then poetry corrupts moral. Sidney replies that poetry does not abuse the human will. It is the human will that abuses poetry. All arts, all sciences can be misused. Medicine can be used as poison, law can be used to oppress. The fault lies not in the art, but its misuse by corrupt practitioners. When correctly employed, poetry presents a virtuous image that steers the reader toward noble conduct. The golden world is the idealized world. Characters of true virtue and clearly portrayed voice serves as models and warning respectively. Sidney also noted that the charge applies selectively. The abuse of verse proves nothing about poetry's intrinsic nature or power. So this is what he said: the poetry cannot corrupt. As example of medicine and law, that they can corrupt person too. It depends on how you use it. So Plato banishes the poet from the ideal republic. Sidney's most nuanced replies that he argues that Plato's condemnation was directed not only on poetry itself, but a specific misuse of poetry that poets do, who propagated false and unworthy representation of the god, presenting the divine as a morally inferior to human, given to lust, jealousy, and violence. Plato's objection was therefore theological, not aesthetic. He objected to bad theology wrapped in verse, not to poetry as such. Sidney also points with characteristic weight that Plato was himself a poet in spirit, that many of his dialogue contain rich poetic passage, and that Plato wrote in style full of imaginative invention. To use Plato against poetry is, Sidney implies, to mistreat Plato. So these are the claims, and these are the answers of Sidney to them. Then the next part, poetry, history, and philosophy, a triumvirate. So one of the Sidney's most celebrated argument is comparison of poetry with two great rivals of for intellectual prestige, history and philosophy. Let's look at them. First, the philosopher, then historian, and then the poet. Dimensions of method of teaching. In philosopher, it is abstract precepts, defines and argue virtue in general terms, while historian, concrete example, illustrate virtue and voice through postiment. Then comes the poet. They use both abstract and concrete, embodies virtue in vivid, ideal fictional character and action. Then the next dimension is accessibility. Accessibility for philosopher is obscure. Only the learned can follow the philosophical argument, whereas for historian, more accessible but bound to fact, cannot construct a perfect example. For poet, it is most accessible, delights all reader regardless of learning. Next dimension, relationship to truth. For philosopher, claims to taste truth, but often obscure and debated among philosophers. For historians, claims to state historical truth, but history is full of moral ambiguity and failure. For poet, it makes no claim to factual truth, but presents idealized moral truths and freely. Then the second last dimension is power to move the will. In philosophy, it is big, abstract arguments rarely motivate action directly. For historian, moderate, real example inspire, but imperfect one discourage. For poet, it is strongest. It is pleasurable, vivid, ideal image moves reader to virtue. The last one is freedom, bound by logical consistency and existing doctrine. For historian, bound by what actually happened. Well, here it is free. For poet, the golden verse suppresses both history and nature. So this shows that what makes poetry great as compared to philosophy and history. So the philosopher teaches what he teaches obscurely, so as the learned one can understand him. That is to say, he teaches them that are already taught, but the poet is the food for the tenderest stomach. Let's now look at common misconceptions. First one is Sidney's ideas were entirely original. They're not. Sidney would not have claimed otherwise. As scholarly reviewers, well, this is the scholar that review. Sidney's apology is the first sentence in the English language of the various strands and concerns of Renaissance literary criticism, drawing on Aristotle, Horace, and most recent writers like Boccaccio, Julius Caesar, Scaliger. Its significance lies precisely in its synthesis, in bringing together classical and continental sources into coherent, rhetorically powerful English language argument, noting the originality of its individual ideas. Then comes the next misconception that Sidney wrote the apology specifically to answer Gaussen. Well, it is a catalyst, it was, but Sidney's real interlocutors are Plato and the broader philosophical tradition that questioned poetry's value. So next one is third misconception. The golden word means Sidney thought poetry was escapist fantasy. Well, it is quite the opposite. The golden word is not escapism, it is a moral idealism made perceptible. Sidney argues that presenting human virtue in its ideal form, the poet gives reader a model more powerful than any real historical example. So it is not escapism. Then the last misconception is Sidney fully reconciled Plato and poetry. Sidney's answer to Platonic charge is rhetorically brilliant but philosophically incomplete. His argument that Plato objected only to bad theology, not to poetry as such, does not fully account for the deeper epistemological critique in the Republic. Plato's concern that mimesis as such product false belief by working through emotion rather than reason. Sidney sidestepped this deeper objection by focusing on the theological dimension of Plato's critique, which is more answerable of the two charges. Well, these are the misconceptions about Sidney. So let's look at the key terms. First one, apologia, or apology. From the Greek apologia, a formal argument in defense of a person, position, or cause, not an expression of regret. Sidney's title signaled that he is acting as advocate for poetry in a formal, judicial oration. The word apology has since shifted in common usage to mean an expression of regret. In Sidney's usage, it means intellectual defense. Let's look at Fore-Conceit. The prior conceptual image of a completed work that exists in the poet's mind before composition began. The poem is the externalization of its inner ideal. The concept distinguishes genuine poetic creation from mechanical imitation. The poet does not copy the world but realizes an ideal pre-existing in imagination. The Fore-Conceit is Sidney's most original philosophical contribution and anticipation, Coleridge's account of the creative imagination. So these are the key terms which are just to be remembered as they're written because they're typically the big definitions of the concept. The golden world, Sidney's term for idealized world the poet creates, one that suppresses the brazen world of nature in its moral perfection and imaginative richness. Nature gives us what it is. The poet delivers what should be. The golden world enables poetry to present virtue in its ideal form and thus to move reader toward noble action more efficiently than history or philosophy can. And poetics, which is the poet as maker, it is the term which is used which is Greek term. Maker or creator. Sidney used this etymology to argue that the poet's activity is uniquely creative, not constrained by what exists, but free to make new words, new characters, new moral possibilities. The poet is a second creator of the god. This etymology also answered the lying charge. The maker never claims the thing that made things is real. So let's make the speaking picture. Sidney's formula for poetry as speaking picture captures the double action of poetic language. It makes its subject visible to the mind while also speaking, arguing, and moving the reader toward virtue. The formula draws on Horace, Haute Pictura Poietes, and the classical rhetorical concept of, well, this is term in Greek, anargia, vivid description, or it can be Latin. A poem that only instructs is tedious, only that delight is trivial. The speaking picture does both. Let's look at the weights. The Latin term for poet prophet. This is the Latin term. Sidney invokes the figure of the weights to argue that across culture and throughout history, poets have been revered as prophets, philosophers, and civilizing forces. David from, well, the reference it is from Psalms, and then Orpheus and Homer, all are the poet as sage, whose words shape the moral and spiritual life of their people. The historical answers the triviality jars. Well, these are the key terms. Now let's look forward, which is the legacy from Elizabethan England to the present. So starting from 1579 to 1580s, which composition written in response to this work, which is Gosson's School of Abuse, a broader Puritan attack on imaginative literature. Then comes the publication in 1598, published in two slightly different versions, which is An Apology for Poetry and A Defence of Poesy. 9 years after his death, then it became immediately recognized as the first systematic work of literary criticism in England, which is basically in English language. Then comes the neoclassical age, 17th century, Dryden and the neoclassical inheritance, Sidney's defense of poetry as a morally instructive art, and his Puritan insistence on delight as a vehicle of instruction fed directly into neoclassical criticism. Dryden and Poe both inherited the framework Sidney established. Then comes Romanticism, which is Romantic Age, 1800, Wordsworth and Coleridge, partial inheritance. So they also use the legacy of Sidney. Then comes the Shelley in 1821, which is a defense of poetry, direct homage. Shelley's A Defence of Poetry is a response to Sidney's title is Deliberate Echo. Well, that was A Defence of Poesy or an apology to poetry. So here it is for Shelley's work, which is A Defence of Poetry. Shelley extended Sidney's argument that poets are unacknowledged legislators of the world, a romantic expansion of Sidney's Waite's tradition. So Sidney's essay is a direct ancestor of Shelley's manifesto. Then comes 20th century, which is present age, containing relevance. Sidney's cultivate whether literature has a moral function, and if so, whether that function can be separated from a static player, continuing contemporary arguments about the social responsibility of fiction, the ethics of representation, and the value of humanities. His answer that moving the reader to pleasure is poetry's unique power, that remains one of the most eloquent defense ever articulated. So this is the legacy of Sidney's work, and this shows the greatness of Sidney still in present age. Let's move forward. So this is from where the data has been taken. This is the reference list. Okay, this is all. You can check out these works in detail if you want to study them in depth. So that's it for today. I hope you understand it, that Sidney is the defender of poetry. Try to defend that poetry is not something trivial. It is not imitation. It is something much more than history and philosophy. It's something great, which is not the imitation of this world. It's meant to create and present an imaginative world according to the imagination of the poet. So that's it for today. I hope you understand it. Thanks for watching. Please do like, subscribe and share, and do comment, as it means a lot for the channel. Have a good day.